Lots of questions coming in. Just as a reminder, please use the Q&A function to submit questions that you might have, and our colleague Kristen is working behind the scenes to pull together your question. There are many of you online today and asking questions. We're going to do our best to get to as many as possible, but we're going to try to focus the most on those questions that are most common to the largest group. If you do have individual questions about that are very specific to your candidacy, you can always feel free to reach out to our office at mba.admissions@yale.edu. So we will start jumping in. We have a couple of questions about test scores. So a question about how we consider the GRE versus the GMAT. Are we truly equally open to both of those? And do we use the GRE conversion tool to look at GRE scores? So I'm going to pass that one to Kate.
Great, thanks, Laurel. So as far as, the choice between taking the GRE and the GMAT, don't let us be kind of the decision maker for you. We truly are test agnostic. You can submit whichever test you feel most comfortable taking. So I've heard, good kind of advice is to maybe take a practice exam in each and then go with the one you think you feel most comfortable with and study for that exam. So that's truly your choice there. And as far as the conversion tool, at this point, we've had years of data on the GRE, and the conversion tool is really not necessary in our review process. So we do look at it as a standalone test.
Great. And Kate, if you'll stand by for another testing related question, are the testing requirements the same for joint degree candidates? And maybe if you want to, in that response, touch a little bit more broadly on if there are any differences to the application process for joint degree candidates.
Yeah, that's a great follow-up and something definitely to be considered as you're considering which test to take. So some of our fellow programs here at Yale, may not accept the GMAT as part of their entrance requirements. So in that case, you may be looking at a GRE. But I will say just broadly about, applying to a joint degree program here at Yale. They are completely separate application processes, and you may have started to understand that when I was talking about different tests. So you will be submitting completely different materials to each school and going through each individual school's application process separately.
This is a question I'll toss out to Jared. So we ask a question in our work experience section and our career interest section as to whether you have plans to become an entrepreneur within the next 3 years outside of business school. So the question is, what is the intent? What are we trying to learn from that question?
Great. Well, thank you for asking. So there are any number of things that, can help us get a better sense of the context that you're in, or better to understand the nuance of what you're doing. And so you might see within the professional area, we're also asking for the number of people you manage, the website of the organization. So we want to do as thorough a job as possible in understanding the context of, your work history. And so definitely, complete as much of that in as great a detail as possible. And in the case of your question, we may not always know the name of your organization if it's a smaller startup organization, the same way we might know a blue chip company name. And so this is really incumbent upon us as readers to understand what it is you've been doing, and we're going to do some research. So if there's a website, if there's a Facebook page, that all helps us. But if it's a startup, that also helps to give us the context of what it is that you've been doing.
Jared, an unrelated question, but while I have you on the line, what is the dress code for the video questions?
Ah, great. Thank you. That's a good question as well. I would recommend the video questions and the interview. Similarly, I would dress like you would if you were speaking to someone in person. So for the interview, we will send a communication that underscores that we recommend it is business dress. For the video questions, I would encourage business dress as well. I would treat it like an interview.
Great, thank you. Rebecca, I'll throw this one out to you. So for someone who has limited quantitative preparation, either in their academic background or in their professional experience, how would you recommend demonstrating quantitative ability through your application?
Yeah, this is something that we see a lot, and so thank you for just addressing that head on. First of all, it's never too late to stop learning. So there's certainly an opportunity to enroll in a course to make sure that you have those skills. Occasionally, we will ask you to enroll or recommend or even require you to enroll in some sort of quantitative preparation course. Sometimes it's as easy as having a relatively high quantitative part of the test score that you do submit, to what Kate was saying earlier, that we're really going to look at all of the different parts of the test score as well. So there are a few opportunities that you can show that you are working towards efficacy on the quantitative front.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. Kate, I have a handful of questions around letters of recommendation, so I'll stay with you for a little bit of time on this one. So most generally, how are recommendations submitted? Will recommenders be directly in contact with us? So maybe just walk through what that process looks like, both from a candidate's perspective and then what the recommender will see.
Great, thank you. So as far as the process for your recommender submitting their recommendation, so what you will do on the application is you will list your recommenders and you will list their contact information. And so once they have been added to your application, it will send them a notification as far as the step-by-step guide to what they need to complete. And so they will complete the recommendations themselves, and they will basically upload them to your application, send them through to the application. So you actually have no part in needing to get that from them and then put it into your application. That is all on the recommender. And I say that to say you also may want to make sure, to follow up with them at certain points in the application, give them enough time to complete that recommendation, and then make sure you're following up with them for them to actually complete their recommendation on time.
Great. Like I said, I have a number of different scenarios that have to do with recommendations. So the first is, who should write my recommendations if I am an entrepreneur?
Great. Yeah, we get this question a lot. And certainly it may be a little more tricky because you don't necessarily have a supervisor to submit your recommendation for you. And that's okay. We totally understand. We get lots of applications from either entrepreneurs or people working in maybe a family business where they just don't have somebody to submit that recommendation, or maybe the person that they can turn to for a recommendation is their mom or their father. And in that case, it doesn't really work. So if you're kind of in one of these situations, you may want to look to a client that you've worked with or that your company is working with, a vendor possibly that you've done work with. If you are a large enough organization where you actually have maybe even a board or you have investors, you can certainly ask them to include a recommendation for you as well. Basically, we're looking for a recommendation from people who have observed you on the job. So even if they are not your formal supervisor, there are certainly people who are seeing you on the day-to-day, and they can serve as really great recommendations.
Great, thank you. Another scenario for recommendations: what if you are not telling your current supervisor that you're planning on applying to business school?
Yeah, that's another great question. And certainly, again, we have students that fall into this all the time. What I will say is, I believe Jared mentioned this in the essay section, but we do have an optional essay for you to include certain kind of maybe extenuating circumstances or just to explain something in your application. I think choice of recommendations can certainly be a really nice use of the optional essay. You just quickly tell us, why you decided not to go with a current supervisor and maybe why you decided on the person you landed on. And so if you're worried about, asking your current supervisor just based on the nature of your work or that you're up for a promotion, certainly go to a former supervisor if you're comfortable. Again, and then the same things apply to what we just talked about with entrepreneurs and those working for a family business. Clients and vendors can certainly work for you as well.
Great, and I think that applies to one of the other scenarios presented, which is if you just started a new job.
Yeah.
I think the same wisdom goes. You want people who are vouching for you, who are most acquainted with your work experience. So if that's not your current supervisor, you can of course briefly explain that to us and go to someone who is going to be able to give a much more representative experience. The last scenario that I'll throw at you, Kate, is for someone who's relatively recently out of undergrad, so maybe 1 to 2 years out. How would you recommend approaching those recommendations? Would you go back to a professor, for instance, for one or both of those?
Yeah, that's another great question, and I think very tempting for students who are just recently or have just recently graduated. What I'll say there is, unless you're a Silver Scholar where we do ask for a faculty or professor recommendation, in most cases, this might not be the best option. You know, we're looking to get to know more about your professional experiences in these recommendations. And so even if you've only been working for a year or two, that's a long time to be working with a supervisor, and they've really gotten to know you. Even a year is a nice bit of time for them to have observed your work. And so in that case, I would still use a professional recommendation over going back to university and getting a faculty member to write your recommendation. And again, I will just echo that the exception to this is if you are a Silver Scholar, we do ask for a faculty recommendation for you.
Great, thank you. I'll leave you alone for a little while, Kate. I'll field a couple of the questions that we're getting just around some of the changes to the round structure and how that will work in response to the pandemic. So some questions around guidance on how to apply to round 3 or round 3 extended if you don't have a test score. So what I would say is that if you have a test score that we could use, or you anticipate being able to get one within that 10-day window after the April 14th deadline, so essentially by April 24th, I would recommend that you submit your application on time for the round 3 April 14th deadline, and then send us your score as soon as you have it. It can be an unofficial score at that point, and we will of course verify the actual score before the end of the round, but you would notify us as soon as possible. If for some reason you are not able to test before that date when you were anticipating being able to, we will then roll your application over into round 3 extended. If you know there is no way that you're going to have a test score before April 24th, essentially, then I would recommend submitting your application in round 3 extended. So again, if you know that you'll be able to get a test after, or you're hoping to be able to get a test after April 24th, but before May 27th, I would target the round 3 extended deadline. Relatedly, although this doesn't only apply to people who are sort of awaiting a test score as their only score, we had a question around guidance for people applying in round, people who may have a new test score to submit over the course of the round. So in that case, and no matter what round you're applying in, we always do try our best to incorporate new information over the course of the round. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to review things that you've sent after the deadline, of course, with the exception of how we're handling test scores in round 3 for for slightly late submissions. But we'll always do our best to incorporate new information. We just can't guarantee. It depends on where we are within the process. But the best advice there is just to be in touch with us as soon as you have that update, as soon as you have an unofficial score, and then we will, as I said, make every effort to try to review that as part of your application. One other related question as well, given the current circumstances. So if you are a current college senior who is learning remotely right now, and some schools have made the move to change their grading systems in accommodation of the new circumstances we're finding ourselves in. The question is, what is the admissions committee going to do with grades that are now all of a sudden on a pass-fail or a credit, no credit scale? And my answer to that is, we understand the circumstances you're in. We're going to make every effort to make the accommodations that we can. The good news is you'll have had, most likely 3.5 years of graded semesters, and we're going to have plenty of academic information from your experience during that time. So there should be no hesitation around what these new circumstances are going to present as far as our evaluating your academic abilities. The last question that I'll field, and then I'll pass it back over to the team, is a broader one. Do you anticipate any changes to the 2020 fall programming due to COVID-19? So what I'll say is it's our hope and it's our expectation that the fall semester will resume in New Haven as usual. However, we understand that the pandemic requires us to leave open the possibility that there may be alterations to the plan. And as the weeks unfold, we'll certainly be in a better position to understand that and to prepare and deploy the appropriate contingency plans should we need to adjust things. So of course we'll keep everyone apprised as we have more information along the way. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jared. We have a couple of questions about interviews. So when will I know if I have been invited to interview, and then who will be conducting the interview?
Okay, great. So we, as a committee, will start reviewing applications immediately after the deadline. We don't review them on a rolling basis. So even if you submit early, we won't start reviewing your application until after the deadline. But you could receive an interview invitation anytime within, a couple days after the admission deadline. That said, if you don't receive one immediately, that's not a bad scenario necessarily. We are reading applications as quickly as we can, and we really will interview up through and close to the decision deadline. So please be patient. If a colleague has gotten an interview invitation, doesn't mean you're not. If someone in the same geography has gotten one, doesn't mean that you're not. But we will send the interview invitation by email. So for whatever you can, do whitelist the extension, at yale.edu or from mba.admissions, because we may be reaching out and sometimes there could be a delay if it goes to your spam folder. So you will get an email interview invitation. Who will do the interviews? It will be an admissions officer if you are applying in round 3 or round 3 extended. And as mentioned previously, it will be a Zoom or somehow a virtual interview, but it will be with an admissions officer. I will say the timeline to schedule in these last 2 rounds will be very quick. We may ask you to schedule within 48 hours, say. That's both because the deadline for sending decisions comes very quickly, as well as there's a herd mentality, if you will, which is other people are being read later and we need to reserve later interview slots for them. So please do try to think of even your other candidates who are applying for admission as part of the same team, if you will. So do try to be as flexible as possible to interview as quickly as you can so that we can leave later spaces for other folks who are read and invited later.
Thank you, Jared. Rebecca, I'll throw this one over to you. We have a question about application fee waivers. Are those available for anyone, and how would you go about requesting one?
That's a great question. I will admit that I'm not an expert on the application fee waivers, so I'll do my best, Laurel. They are certainly available for both round 3 and round 3 extended, and there's sort of no changes on who is eligible. That includes everybody from Teach for America or 14 Launch Fellows or the list we mentioned on our website, U.S. military veterans. And so the system should automatically give you a fee waiver, I believe, if it can pick up that you fall into some of these cases. If not, please feel free to email the inbox that is listed on the slide here, mba.admissions@yale.edu. So hopefully I didn't screw that one up.
I'll throw you an easier one in a moment. I will note there should be very clear instructions in the application instructions once you've opened up an application, and you'll be guided as well to input your information into a form if you're asking for an application fee waiver. So I think that'll be very straightforward. And most importantly, I think as Rebecca mentioned, there's no changes in rounds 3 and round 3 extended. If you were eligible for a fee waiver previously, that will continue through round 3 and round 3 extended. I will, let's see. A question around how non-traditional candidates can set themselves apart within the application process. And so maybe you want to comment on the idea of a non-traditional candidate, and then just more generally how people can present themselves within the application process to put their best foot forward.
Yeah, absolutely. That one's, believe it or not, a lot easier for me to do. So I think the interesting thing is how many people actually consider themselves non-traditional candidates. And having done this on and off since 2001, it's actually personally a really cool thing to see. When I started in admissions, almost everybody was from a traditional pre-MBA background, and certainly that is less and less the case. That being said, the traditional pre-MBA backgrounds are still solid applications. I think by definition of coming from not those industries or not those backgrounds, you already sort of stand out. I frankly feel like too much attention is being put on how can I stand out? And reality is everybody has a complex identity, and your job is just to use the real estate of the application wisely to tell your story and help us connect the dots of who you are, what makes you tick, why you want to do this MBA, why now, and what you're going to do with it in the world. How are you going to impact the communities that you're a part of? So spend less time on thinking about how you're going to stand out, because I assure you most people stand out just by virtue of the things they do and the entire package. So the real, I think, difficulty or challenge is crafting your application in a way that really best highlights that whole story.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. I appreciate that.
Was that better, Laura?
It was. Well, and I'm being reminded behind the scenes of our application fee waiver process as well. One more thing that I'll note, again, I would definitely direct you to the application instructions to find the form there, but our request is that if you are going to put in a request for an application fee waiver, please do that at least 48 hours prior to the deadline, so that we'll be able to process that in plenty of time for you to submit your application on time. Thank you, Kristen, for that. Kate, I'm going to toss this one over to you. So what can I do if I have a lower GPA that I don't feel is representative of my ability and my commitment to academics?
Great, thanks. And so I think Rebecca started talking about this a little bit in a previous question, but there are definitely some things that you can do kind of preemptively before you apply to a program. I mean, you're certainly welcome to potentially take a course or to kind of show that you can be successful in an MBA classroom. So, I mean, relevant courses to an MBA would be preferred. So maybe a microeconomics course or a statistics course would be really helpful in kind of showing that. That's one thing. I will say, we've said it a couple times on this panel, but this is a really holistic process. We are looking at every piece of your application. And so certainly, I think one thing that you can do in the process, as again, Rebecca was kind of just talking about, is kind of own up to the weaknesses as much as the strengths of your application. An optional essay can be a really nice chance for you to maybe highlight maybe some things that were going on, some extenuating circumstances that were happening during your undergraduate experience that may have contributed to a lower GPA. Perhaps you were working quite a bit outside of your studies. So these are things that can certainly help us to just kind of put into context these grades as well. So it maybe isn't necessarily a way to completely overcome it, but again, it helps the admissions committee just to understand where you were in that point in your life. And I did talk about the behavioral assessment, and kind of the whole reason it was developed was to have another data point outside of just your GPA and your test scores in order for us to feel comfortable taking chances on students who may have a lower academic profile.
Great, thank you, Kate. I'll field a couple of these questions that are coming in myself. We have a question about, will applicants to round 3 extended be disadvantaged in any way? Certainly not from an evaluation standpoint. We maintain the same standards throughout our entire applications cycle, even in this new extended time frame as well. I think the only question there is a matter of, as we move into round 3, even in a traditional year, it's somewhat subject to the availability of space in the class. And so we will certainly plan for the ability to admit qualified candidates in both round 3 and round 3 extended. But as we get further into the year, it's just a little bit more subject to the amount of available space in the class. So that's certainly something to think about, and also to think about in terms of scholarship funding that's available at later stages of the year. As I think I mentioned earlier as well, there comes some peace of mind on your end of having your application in a little bit earlier, getting a decision a little bit earlier if you need to get a visa process underway and the move to New Haven launched. All of this is obviously easier to start a little bit earlier versus later, but I do want to underscore that from our evaluation standards, we'll be looking at round 3 extended just as we would at any other round. Looking beyond that, we have a question or some questions around our 2020-2021 application cycle and when that application will go live. And so traditionally our New Year's application will launch sometime in early to mid-July. So that's approximately the time frame. I have a question about whether the essay question will remain the same. We every year we take a deep dive into our application and make sure that we are asking, as I mentioned before, the kinds of questions that really help us understand and evaluate your candidacy. So every year we consider our essay question amongst all the other aspects of the application. We haven't launched into that process for the coming year yet, so I can't say for certain whether the essay will or will not remain the same, but we will often announce our essay topic even before the application itself has come live. So you can stay tuned for that in the coming months. Also have a general question about our evaluation process and how many members of our team are looking at an application, what that looks like. I'll give a very brief overview of that. So every single application that we receive is read and it is reviewed by multiple members of our committee at various points. We have committee members who will do a deep read on applications. We'll get together as full committees or as partial committees to discuss interview decisions, and then our entire team convenes to ultimately render an admissions decision on your candidacy. So you can rest assured we have multiple touch points within the team, which really helps us as well, because each of us has been doing this for a while, but also brings different perspectives and different points of views, and might see something in an application that another person might not see in the same way. So we have a lot of healthy and productive dialogue about your candidacy at various checkpoints along the way. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into our process there. A couple of more questions coming through. Just a moment. A brief one, Kate. Do recommendations need to be submitted by the application deadline, or is there a little bit of a window there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do have a little bit of a window there. So in the application, we actually give you the deadline, and we also give you the materials deadline. And so the materials deadline would include your letters of recommendation. So typically there's a few days grace period for you to get those in. I still encourage you to keep on your recommenders to get those in, but we understand this is something that's out of your hands. So yes, there is certainly a grace period.
Great. Kate, I'm going to toss this one to you as well. And actually, even before I do so, I will point out for round 3 extended, I think it would really be to your benefit as far as moving the application process along if you are able to get your recommendations in by that extended deadline. I think we will have a little bit less of a window than we might in a typical deadline to be able to have all of your materials together and get you a decision as soon as possible. So I would definitely encourage your recommenders, even more so than usual in round 3 extended, to move those recommendations along. But Kate, this next question to you: are there avenues to reach out to alumni or current students to hear their perspectives as we go through this and go through the process of learning about Yale SOM?
Yeah, of course there are. And thanks for that follow-up, Laurel, on round 3 extended. So absolutely reach out to our current students. So on our website, we have about 70 student ambassadors from our second year, just from our second year class, who have signed up to be there for you to ask questions of throughout this process. So please don't hesitate to reach out to them. You can find, like I said, you can find them on our website. You can sort them by industry, by interest, by affinity group. but where they're coming from in the world. So you can ask questions of multiple students throughout this process. And I think our students are, trying to be as accommodating as possible under the circumstances that, our students can no longer come for campus visits, and they understand that. So they are, definitely willing to be a resource to you throughout this process.
Great. And I'll note that we have had some questions about whether we plan to host campus visits in the fall. As I said before, we're very hopeful that we will be able to proceed as normal once the fall comes around, but we'll certainly keep everyone posted. In the meanwhile, we're working very hard to have a slew of virtual options open to you. I'm going to toss one last question out to Jared, and then we'll wrap up for the day. So Jared, this question is around work gaps. How can I best explain to the admissions committee the circumstances around why I may have a gap between work experiences or between my undergraduate experience and starting to work, or all the different ways that work circumstances can look a little bit nonlinear?
Great. Yeah, and I think this ties a few things together. We had some questions about non-traditional candidates, and thanks to Kate for mentioning the optional statements, which I think it's a catch-all, if you will. I would expect that we will see a few more people than usual use the optional statements in round 3 and round 3 extended. For many candidates, they never use this portion. It may be just that there's a fairly straightforward rationale presented for their MBA case, but there may be a gap, and maybe even a perceived gap. I think sometimes that's a helpful perspective to have as well, is there actually may be no gap, but as you look at your resume or someone else looks at your resume, they perceive a gap. So definitely have a third set of eyes to look at your application, but use the optional statements. Anything that might be a perceived gap in professional experience, undergraduate, start to finish. Maybe there's a reason why the test was delayed for you, and that's why you're applying in round 3 or round 3 extended. Anything can go into the optional statements. As I said, many people will not use it, although I think in the current environment we're in, we'll probably see a few more than usual. It's really not intended to be an essay, so do feel free even just to have bullet points of some of those aspects.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you so much to you for your great questions. I'm going to have to thank my children for not storming in over the course of this. I've promised them great rewards, so I'm going to go take care of that. I'm hoping all of you will stay well and stay healthy and keep engaging with us. We'll be hosting an online student panel on April 2nd via Zoom, so we hope that you'll be able to join us for that. And as I mentioned before, if you have any questions along the way, even though we're not physically in our space, we're still certainly in touch. You can always reach out to mba.admissions@yale.edu. Thanks so much, everyone, and be well.